A 76-year-old man walked onto a Marine sniper range carrying a rifle older than every shooter on the line. The youngest Marine turned to his spotter and said, "Somebody tell Grandpa the museum is down the road." The old man said nothing. He just set his case down on the bench and waited. 20 minutes later, a 2-star general was standing behind him, and every Marine on that range was at attention. "If you respect those who served in silence, comment marksman before we begin." His name was Earl Jessup, 76 years old, lived alone in a clapboard house about 9 miles from Camp Lejeune in Jacksonville, North Carolina. Most mornings he drove his 2004 Ford Ranger to the hardware store, bought whatever small thing he needed and drove home. He had a vegetable garden out back. He kept 3 chickens. His neighbors knew him as a quiet man who waved from his porch but never said much. The mailman once told someone at the post office that Earl Jessup was the politest person on his route, but he could not recall ever hearing the man speak more than 6 words at a time. Earl wore the same rotation of flannel shirts and khaki pants. His hands were steady for a man his age, and his eyes, pale blue behind wire-frame glasses, still carried a sharpness that most people never noticed because they never looked long enough. There was nothing about Earl Jessup that announced what he had been. No bumper stickers on his truck, no flag patches on his jacket, no veteran's ball cap. He had a small box in his bedroom closet that contained things he never showed anyone. That box held the story of a different man, a man most people in Jacksonville had no idea existed. The invitation came through a connection Earl had not used in decades. A retired gunnery sergeant named Tom Pelletier, who lived 2 towns over, had stayed in loose contact with Earl over the years. Tom was one of the few people alive who knew the full scope of what Earl had done during his years in uniform. Tom had received a phone call from his nephew, a staff sergeant currently assigned to the 2nd Marine Division's Scout Sniper platoon at Lejeune. The nephew mentioned that the platoon was holding an open marksmanship event that weekend, an informal competition on the long-range course. Some civilian shooters had been invited, a few retired Marines. It was partly a recruitment visibility event, partly a chance for the young snipers to show off their skills with the latest equipment. Tom Pelletier hung up the phone and sat quietly for a long time. Then he called Earl. Earl listened without interrupting. When Tom finished, there was a pause. Then Earl said, "What time does it start?" Tom smiled on the other end of the line. He had known Earl long enough to understand what that question meant. It did not mean Earl was curious. It meant Earl was going. Saturday morning broke clear and cool, October in North Carolina. The range was set up on the extended course at Lejeune's Stone Bay Complex, a facility purpose-built for long-distance precision shooting. The line was busy by 0800. 8 scout snipers from the platoon were rotating through positions. They had M40 A6 rifles, Nightforce ATACR scopes, custom loads, and every advantage that modern ballistic technology could offer. The targets were set at intervals from 800 to 1500 yards. A few steel silhouettes had been placed at 1800, and at the far end of the range, barely visible to the naked eye, a single steel plate sat at 2000 yards. That plate was mostly ceremonial. It had been placed there as a reference marker more than a serious target. In training, shots beyond 1500 yards were considered extreme range. 2000 was theoretical for most shooters. Even with perfect conditions, the bullet would be in the air for nearly 3 full seconds. Wind drift at that distance could push a round several feet off target. The young snipers knew the plate was there. They also knew that none of them had ever hit it. Earl arrived in his Ford Ranger at 0815. He parked at the far end of the gravel lot, away from the newer trucks and tactical vehicles. He stepped out slowly, the way older men do when their knees have logged more miles than their odometers. He reached into the truck bed and pulled out a long hard case, scuffed and sun-faded, with no brand markings visible. He also grabbed a small canvas bag. He walked toward the range at his own pace, unhurried, his boots crunching on gravel. Tom Pelletier was already there, waiting near the check-in table. He nodded at Earl. Earl nodded back. That was their greeting. It had always been enough. At the check-in table, a young lance corporal looked at Earl, then at the case, then back at Earl. He asked for identification. Earl handed over his driver's license. The lance corporal typed something into a laptop, glanced at the screen, and handed the license back without any change in expression. "Civilian lane 4, sir. Eye and ear protection required on the line." Earl took his license and walked toward lane 4 without another word. The first comments started within minutes. 3 of the younger snipers were between rotations sitting on a bench behind the firing line, hydrating and checking their phones. One of them, a corporal named Devin Marsh, noticed Earl setting up at lane 4. Marsh nudged the Marine next to him, a lance corporal named Rios. "Check out lane 4, Marsh said. Rios looked over. He saw a thin older man in a flannel shirt opening a battered rifle case. When the case opened, Rios actually laughed. Inside was a Remington 700, a model that looked like it had been manufactured sometime in the early 1980s. It had a wooden stock worn smooth at the grip. The bluing on the barrel had faded in patches. The scope mounted on top was an Ertl 10 power, a fixed magnification optic that had no illumination, no ballistic turret, and no range-finding reticle. It was the kind of scope you might find in a display case at a gun show, not on a firing line at a Marine sniper range. The third Marine on the bench, a sergeant named Cahill, looked over and shook his head. "That thing belongs in a shadow box," he said. "What's he going to shoot at, 800? Marsh grinned. "Bet you $20 he can't hit steel at 1,000. Rios raised the stakes. "I'll put 50 on it. No way that scope even tracks that far." They were not being cruel in their own minds. They were young. They had trained on the most advanced sniper systems the Marine Corps had ever fielded. They had spotting scopes that could read license plates at a mile. They had ballistic computers that calculated wind, elevation, Coriolis effect, spindrift, and air density. The idea that a 76-year-old man with a 40-year-old rifle could compete on their range was to them genuinely amusing. It was not personal. They simply did not know who they were looking at. Earl settled into position at lane 4. He did not rush. He opened his canvas bag and removed a small spiral notebook, its pages yellowed and soft from years of handling. He removed a handheld wind meter, a Kestrel, one of the older models. He removed a box of ammunition. The rounds were hand loads. Earl had loaded them himself at his kitchen table, using a single-stage press that he had owned since 1979. Each round was weighed, measured, and seated with a precision that would have satisfied any ballistics lab in the country. He had been loading his own ammunition for over 50 years. He knew the velocity, the ballistic coefficient, and the trajectory of each round the way a pianist knows the keys. He set the notebook open beside him, though he barely glanced at it. The data in that notebook was mostly already in his head. He lay prone behind the rifle, adjusted his position with small deliberate movements, and settled his cheek against the worn wooden stock. He took 3 slow breaths. Then he began. His first shot was at 800 yards. The steel rang. He cycled the bolt without lifting his head. His second shot was at 1,000. The steel rang again. The third shot, 1,100. A hit. At this point, the conversation on the bench behind the line had stopped. Marsh, Rios, and Cahill were watching now. Not laughing, not talking, just watching. Earl fired at 1,200 yards. Hit. 1,300. Hit. Each shot was followed by a pause of roughly 20 seconds. During those pauses, Earl would check his Kestrel, make a small adjustment to his scope, and settle back in. His movements were economical. There was no wasted motion, no fidgeting, no second-guessing. He moved the way a man moves when he has done something 10,000 times and his body no longer needs instructions from his brain. 1,400 yards, hit. 1,500. The steel sang out across the range with a delayed clang that arrived a full second after the muzzle flash. By now, other shooters on the line had stopped what they were doing. A small cluster of Marines had gathered behind lanes 3 and 5, watching lane 4. The range safety officer, a staff sergeant named Womack, had walked over and was standing with binoculars pressed to his eyes, tracking Earl's impacts. Earl paused after the 1,500-yard shot. He sat up slowly, stretched his neck, and took a drink of water from a metal thermos he had brought in his canvas bag. He checked his Kestrel again. He wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked downrange toward the steel plate at 2,000 yards. Tom Pelletier, standing a few feet behind Earl, saw the look. Tom had seen that look before, a long time ago, in a place neither of them talked about. It was the look Earl got when he was calculating, not guessing. Calculating. Tom said nothing. He just folded his arms and waited. Earl settled back into position behind the rifle. He made a significant adjustment to his scope elevation turret, counting the clicks audibly. He checked the wind. The flags at the 1,000-yard line were showing a light crosswind from the right, maybe 5 miles per hour. But at 2,000 yards, the wind at the target could be completely different from the wind at the shooter's position. This was where experience separated competence from mastery. A computer could calculate the wind at the firing line. Only a human who had spent decades reading terrain, grass, mirage, and dust could estimate what the wind was doing a mile away. Earl took 4 breaths. On the 5th, he held at the natural respiratory pause. The range had gone quiet. Even the Marines who did not know what was happening could feel the shift. There is a silence that settles over a firing line when something significant is about to occur. It is not commanded. It happens on its own. Earl pressed the trigger. The rifle cracked, sharp and clean, and the recoil pushed the stock back into his shoulder. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bullet was in flight. At 2,000 yards, travelling at the velocity Earl's hand loads produced, the round would be airborne for approximately 2.8 seconds. That is an eternity in precision shooting. The bullet had to travel through layers of air moving at different speeds and directions. It had to resist the pull of gravity that was dragging it earthward the moment it left the barrel. It had to maintain enough velocity at the end of its journey to strike the steel with authority. 2.8 seconds. The small group of Marines standing behind the line held their breath without realizing it. Staff Sergeant Womack had his spotting scope locked on the 2,000-yard plate. The clang arrived late, the way thunder follows lightning. A clear, unmistakable ring of a bullet striking steel. Womack pulled back from his scope. His face had changed. He looked at Earl, then at Tom Pelletier, then back at Earl. "Did that just happen?" he said. Tom Pelletier did not smile. He just nodded once, the way men do when they have been expecting something that everyone else finds impossible. The reaction on the line was immediate. Corporal Marsh stood up from the bench. His expression was not amusement anymore. It was something closer to disbelief. Rios had his hand on the back of his neck, staring down range as if the steel plate might offer an explanation. Sergeant Cahill said nothing, but he had taken off his sunglasses, which for Cahill was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The other Marines in the area were talking in low voices. A few were pulling out their phones. Staff Sergeant Womack walked directly to the range office, a small cinder block building near the parking lot. He picked up the phone and made a call. He did not call his platoon sergeant. He did not call his company commander. He called the office of the base commanding general's aide-de-camp. The conversation was short. Womack said, "Sir, I have a situation on Range 6 that the general is going to want to see personally. I cannot adequately explain it over the phone. I am requesting the general's presence at his earliest convenience." The aide asked what kind of situation. Womack paused and said, "Sir, a 76-year-old civilian just hit the 2,000-yard plate with a Remington 700 and a fixed 10-power scope. Cold bore. I watched it through my spotting scope. I have multiple witnesses." The aide was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would relay the message. The general arrived in 40 minutes. Brigadier General Raymond Tate, Assistant Division Commander of the 2nd Marine Division. He came in a standard government vehicle with his aide and Sergeant Major. When the vehicle pulled up to the range, the Marines on the line noticed immediately. A general officer at a routine range event was unusual. A general officer arriving with visible urgency was unprecedented. Tate stepped out of the vehicle and walked directly toward the firing line. He was in his service uniform, which suggested he had come from his office without changing. Womack met him halfway and began to brief him quietly. Tate listened, his face revealing nothing. Then he said, "Where is he?" Womack pointed toward Lane 4, where Earl Jessup was sitting on the bench behind his rifle, drinking water from his thermos as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Tate walked toward Lane 4. The Marines on the line made way without being told. As Tate approached, Tom Pelletier stepped forward slightly. Tate noticed Tom first. His eyes narrowed. Then he looked past Tom to the man on the bench. Earl looked up. For a moment, the two men regarded each other in silence. The Marines standing nearby could feel the weight of that silence, even if they did not understand it. General Tate spoke first. "Earl Jessup," he said. It was not a question. Earl set down his thermos and stood up slowly. He did not snap to attention. He was a civilian and had been for decades, but his posture straightened in a way that carried its own kind of respect. "General," Earl said. Tate stepped closer. "The last time I saw you, I was a second lieutenant, and you were the reason half my platoon made it home from Khe Sanh." The words landed on the assembled Marines like a physical force. Khe Sanh. the 77-day siege in 1968, one of the most brutal engagements of the Vietnam War. The name alone carried weight that every Marine on that range recognized. Earl said nothing. He looked at the ground briefly, the way a man does when someone mentions a chapter of his life that still costs him something to remember. Tate turned to the Marines standing behind them. His voice carried command authority, the kind that does not need volume. For those of you who do not know, and I suspect that is all of you, this man is Gunnery Sergeant Earl Jessup, retired. During the siege of Khe Sanh, Gunnery Sergeant Jessup operated as a scout sniper attached to the 26th Marine Regiment. Over the course of 77 days, he recorded 93 confirmed kills from positions that were under constant enemy artillery, mortar and ground assault. He did it with a rifle not significantly different from the one sitting on that bench right now. The silence on the range was total, Tate continued. Gunnery Sergeant Jessup's longest confirmed engagement during Khe Sanh was at 1,940 yards. He made that shot under incoming mortar fire, using a bolt-action rifle and a fixed-power scope to eliminate an NVA officer who was directing an assault on the base perimeter. That single shot disrupted the attack and gave the defensive line time to reorganize. The battalion commander credited that shot with saving an estimated 30 to 40 Marines. Tate paused and looked back at Earl, who was standing very still, his jaw set, his pale blue eyes fixed on some middle distance that was not the range, and was not North Carolina, and was not 1968, but was somewhere between all of those things. After Vietnam, Tate said, Gunnery Sergeant Jessup served 2 more tours, including operations in Beirut and Panama. He received the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor Device, and a Purple Heart. He retired in 1992 and, as far as I can tell, never told a single person any of this unless they already knew. Tate turned back to Earl. Is that about right, Gunny? Earl looked at him. A faint smile crossed his face, the first expression beyond calm neutrality that anyone on that range had seen from him. You always did talk too much, Lieutenant, he said. The response was instant. A wave of quiet laughter moved through the Marines, followed by something deeper. Respect. Not the kind that is ordered, not the kind that comes from rank or regulation, the kind that is earned across decades and recognized in a single moment. Corporal Marsh, the same Marine who had joked about the museum, stepped forward. He did not say a word. He came to attention and rendered a salute. Marsh was not required to salute a retired enlisted Marine. He did it because something in him demanded it. Rios followed, then Cahill, then Womack. One by one, every Marine on that range came to attention and saluted Gunnery Sergeant Earl Jessup, retired. Earl looked at them. He did not cry. Men like Earl Jessup had learned a long time ago how to hold the weight of the world behind their eyes without letting it spill over. But his hand came up steady and precise, and he returned the salute with a crispness that 50 years of civilian life had not eroded. General Tate stood beside him and did not interrupt the moment. He understood what was happening. It was not ceremony, it was recognition. It was a line of young warriors acknowledging that the old man with the worn rifle and the flannel shirt was one of them, had always been one of them. After the salutes dropped, the atmosphere on the range shifted completely. The formality dissolved into something warmer, but no less respectful. Sergeant Cahill approached Earl and asked, with genuine humility, if Earl would be willing to look at his shooting position and offer any corrections. Earl agreed with a nod. Over the next 2 hours, Gunnery Sergeant Earl Jessup, 76 years old, walked the firing line and quietly coached some of the best young snipers the Marine Corps had produced. He corrected trigger control with a touch on the shoulder. He explained wind reading not in terms of formulas and algorithms, but in terms of grass movement and mirage patterns, and the way dust behaves differently at different distances. He spoke about natural point of aim the way a man speaks about breathing. It was not technique to him, it was part of who he was. The young Marines listened with an intensity that no classroom lecture had ever produced. Corporal Marsh later told another Marine that he learned more in 2 hours from Earl Jessup than he had in 6 weeks of sniper school. That was probably an exaggeration, but it captured something true about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, between training and experience. General Tate stayed for the entire session. Before he left, he pulled Earl aside. The conversation was private, but Tom Pelletier, standing close enough to hear fragments, later pieced together the essence of it. Tate told Earl that the Marine Corps had a responsibility to its history, and that history included the men who had written it. He told Earl that he intended to formally invite him to serve as a civilian advisor to the division's Scout Sniper training program. Not a full-time obligation. Just periodic visits. A chance to pass down the kind of knowledge that cannot be found in any manual. Earl was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'll think about it." Tom Pelletier knew what that meant. It meant yes. In the weeks that followed, the story of what happened on Range 6 spread through the 2nd Marine Division, the way all good stories spread in the military, by word of mouth embellished slightly at each retelling, but never straying far from the core truth. The old man and the 2,000-yard shot, the Marines who bet against him, the general who knew his name. Earl Jessup returned to the base 3 weeks later for his first advisory session. He brought the same Remington 700. He brought the same canvas bag. He wore a flannel shirt and khaki pants. But this time, when he walked onto the range, every Marine on the line stopped what they were doing and stood. Not at attention, not formally. They just stood. The way you stand when someone enters a room and you want them to know that their presence matters. Earl nodded to them the way he always nodded. Minimal, sufficient. Then he got to work. Corporal Marsh, the Marine who had made the museum joke, requested a personal meeting with Earl after the first advisory session. He apologized directly. Earl looked at him for a moment and said, "Son, I've been underestimated by people a lot more dangerous than you. Don't lose sleep over it. Just remember what it felt like when you found out you were wrong and carry that with you the next time you meet somebody you think you figured out in 5 seconds." Marsh never forgot those words. He repeated them to every new Marine who joined the platoon for the rest of his career. The Remington 700 that Earl carried onto that range was not just a rifle, it was a record. Every scratch on the stock, every wear mark on the bolt handle, every faded patch of bluing told a piece of a story that spanned 5 decades and 3 wars. Earl had maintained it with the same discipline that defined everything else in his life. The bore was immaculate, the action was glass smooth. The trigger broke at exactly 2.5 pounds, the same setting it had been adjusted to in 1969. That rifle had spoken for Earl in places where words did not matter, and only precision counted. It had spoken at Khe Sanh when the perimeter was collapsing. It had spoken in the mountains outside Beirut. It had spoken one more time at 2,000 yards on a clear October morning in North Carolina. And every time it spoke, someone listened. Earl Jessup continued advising the Scout Sniper platoon for the next 2 years. He never accepted any formal title or compensation. He came when he was able, taught what he knew, and left without fanfare. The Marines who trained under him spoke about the experience with a reverence that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with the recognition that they had been taught by a master. When Earl passed away at 78, in his sleep, in the same clapboard house where he had lived quietly for 30 years, the 2nd Marine Division sent a full honour guard to his funeral. General Tate, by then retired himself, attended personally. At the graveside, after the rifles fired and the bugler played taps, Tate placed a single item on the casket alongside the folded flag. It was a photograph, black and white, faded at the edges. It showed a young Marine in Vietnam-era utilities, prone behind a bolt-action rifle, his eye pressed to a fixed-power scope, his face calm and focused in the middle of what the background clearly showed was chaos. Written on the back of the photograph, in handwriting that had not changed in 50 years, were 2 words: "Still shooting." The Marines who carried Earl Jessup to his rest that day were the same Marines he had coached on Range 6. They requested the duty, every one of them. There are men and women walking among us every single day whose stories we will never know unless we take the time to look past what we see on the surface. Earl Jessup wore flannel shirts and drove an old truck and kept chickens in his backyard. He also held a firing line at Khe Sanh for 77 days and saved more lives with one rifle than most people will impact in a lifetime. The uniform comes off, the rank is retired, but what a person has done, what they have endured, what they have given, that does not retire. It does not fade. It does not diminish with age or quiet living. It sits inside a person like a round in a chamber, ready, waiting, and still perfectly capable of hitting its mark. The next time you see someone and think you know their story from the outside, remember Earl Jessup and the 2,000-yard shot. Remember that silence is not emptiness, patience is not weakness, and the steadiest hands on any range might belong to the person you least expect. Subscribe to the channel if you believe that respect is earned in silence and proven when it matters most.